in Jesus? That's a fun thing. It's one of the questions I have on my tests. So if you go and you look at test 1, you're thinking about working on the test as you go along. Notice we already were considering why Socrates was put on trial. Did he really corrupt youth? And is that considered corrupting youth today? That's no right or wrong answer to that, right? As long as there's 300 words plus, right? There you go. You're all set. So say what you think. But notice the last question, question number 6, compares Socrates to Jesus of Nazareth. In what ways might they be similar, and what ways might they be dissimilar? Remember, they didn't exist at the same time. Socrates died in 399 BC. And BC, what does BC stand for?
Before Christ.
Before Christ. So that's 399 years before, theoretically, Jesus was born, right? Which is problematic, because if he was born in year 1, then there had to be a year 0, the way we count. But the church forgot to do that. So they had year 1 BC and then 1 AD, Anno Domini, right? And so there was a mathematical mistake there, because there was no, wait a minute, what happened to the year in between? So that's kind of interesting. Today you often see, instead of BC, you see BCE. Yes? And what does that stand for?
Before the common era.
Before the common era. Or you might think of it as before Christ even. Could be funny, you know. That's just how to make the calendar secular as opposed to Anno Domini. You know, you've got the CE, the common era. Right? Does that make sense? Does it work? Not if you were raised Roman Catholic. It's like, wait a minute, I know what that is. Silly stuff. But so, yeah, that's a fun question. So if you feel like it. By the way, there's another one. What philosopher we have discussed would you use to give a person guidance in leading a good life? And why do you think this advice would be the best? People will, you know, especially about that point in the semester, we'll be looking at the post-Aristotelians, so that you'll be looking at, you know, the Stoics, the Epicureans, the Cynics, the skeptics. You know, there's all those different choices. But one of the things that certainly works is for some people who feel that Jesus would be a good choice for that, to pick Jesus, because who would say that Jesus wasn't a philosopher, at least, you know? So there's that possibility too. So if you're looking at the test as something you could be doing as we're going, there you go. Lots of interesting questions there. But off of that one. Okay. Something I should mention. There's books I mentioned by Eric Havelock. That's also interesting to me that one of Eric Havelock's sons was John Havelock, who was a friend of mine. He died 3 years ago at 87. But nonetheless, it's kind of, for all those years that I knew him and we talked about it, he gave me a book about his father and so on. His father was a philosopher in Toronto and then Harvard. But his specialty was analysis of ancient languages, basically. And his focus was on Plato. And one of the things he argued in his book, The Muse Learns to Write. The Muse Learns to Write, which I can show you. Oops. I could have went right to the Muse. I have that here. is to point out that despite the fact that Plato, Socrates too, seem to dislike writing, they feel like writing is going to screw us up. It's like using ChatGPT instead of everybody writing. Same kind of difference almost, because if you're writing, you don't have to memorize everything, because you can always go back to your writing and check instead of your memory, right? And memory had been the main source of knowledge, right? And one of the things about that was that the muse spoke in poetry, and Plato disliked the poets. Why the heck would he dislike the poets? That was the way people were supposed to remember things, because by having it in rhyme, same way we also can use melodies, songs to remember things, right? But by having it in a rhyme, you're literally able to just remember it, easier than you would otherwise. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wave. All mimsy were the borogoves and the momraths outgrabe. Beware the jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the claws that catch. Anybody know this? Yes, Emmett does. Just cool, It's a stupid poem. Beware the jubjub bird, shun the frumious bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the something foe he sought.
Maxim?
Something like that. Cool. In any case, I used to know it and be able to go. I probably still could. Just might have to practice it. I didn't expect to do that. But you get the idea. Poetry helps us remember stuff and rhymes. The trouble is that when we look at poetry, it generally identifies a specific individual accomplishing a specific deed. I mentioned Achilles, for example, right? And so when we're trying to study virtue, as the Greeks would have been from their poetry, they're learning individual instances of actions as opposed to a general definition of what is pious, or a general definition of what is love, etc. Right? So when you switch from poetry to prose, which is what Havelock argues is happening at this point in our cultural history, at least with the Greeks, right? That the Greeks are shifting to prose instead of poetry. Now we begin thinking about the definitions of these concepts, because now instead of thinking of only the particular cases of where an event is memorized in a poem, we begin thinking, well, okay, here's love here, here's love here, here's love here, here's love. What do all of these have in common that shows that they're love? Especially when what you get are difficulties, because that's not the same kind of love as this one, and this, they're different. So the problem that Plato is trying to figure out when he's creating these ideas, and this seems to be what he's doing, is now using the word to represent a concept that he thinks is unchanging, persistent, the real thing. Yeah, what we call Platonic in that sense, right? That's the idea, that the ideas are what persist and are real because they're not constantly changing. Things that are existing with matter are constantly in flux. And the problem that a lot of those pre-Socratics were trying to explain with their concepts of the main arche of what everything is made of is how to explain both persistence and change. Because things remain the same, but they also change. And you get a dilemma there, because how can a table not always have been the table? I mean, it becomes a table and it'll eventually be in the dump and destroyed by all kinds of events and so on, right? And us too. But it seems like for Plato, the ideas are always the same. Of course, for Plato, the whole problem he has is he can't quite figure out exactly what they are. So you end up with that kind of a dilemma. Right? And as we will see, his answer, and this can lead us into several different dialogues, including the Meno, which I hope you found difficulty with, because it's so long, for one thing. There's multiple things going on there, right? Not only a teaching method with the slave boy, where he guides the slave boy by his questions to show that the slave boy somehow already knew how to solve the Pythagorean theorem, right? Somehow, and that well, if this square is this long, and you want to double it, how do you, etc. Well, what eventually the boy ends up discovering is what we would call the Pythagorean theorem, right? And then he steps back and says, "See, he knew that already. You're not really teaching. You're helping them to remember what their mind already knew." And how is that possible? I mean, the kid's obviously, a kid. Well, as far as Plato seems to be concerned, our souls are forever. They always were and always will be. By the way, let me retreat a little bit here and go to specific dialogues. So the Crito would have been the one after the Apology. The Crito, you can look up all sorts of summaries and things, arguments going on. But the Crito, by the way, is the root word for critical. Just so you notice it. Does that mean that Crito is introducing us to critical thinking? Probably not, because he's wrong as far as Socrates is concerned. He's come to Socrates to point out, if you looked at it, that his friends and he have put together enough money to bribe everybody necessary in order for Socrates to leave, so he doesn't have to die. We're all set. Come on, come with us. But Socrates obviously has already told him before, and now he insists on it, that he's not going to leave. He's going to stay and commit suicide when they bring him the news from the ship that has to come back, but also because the gods have to approve his execution. And the ship, had to go to a place where the approval would be given by the gods, and then have to sail back. Their iPhones weren't working for some reason, and at that point, Socrates expects to drink the hemlock. Would you like to see something funny? This could be funny. Have you ever seen this?
Socrates, the trial is over. Here's your hemlock. Thank you.
It's a much bigger cup than he would have had. But.
Well, what was the verdict? When do I get out of here? But Socrates, the verdict was dead. Death? You gotta be kidding me. For what? For teaching the youth wisdom. Well, I'll take it all back. Come in here, renounce everything. Let's get out of here. Let's go get some Chinese food. But Socrates, you drank the hemlock. So what? It's poisonous. It is? Since when? Didn't you know hemlock is poisonous? I do now. Look, I only know general things. What is truth? What is justice? I'm going to learn details. I don't know what is poisonous and what is not poisonous. The kind of thing that irritates me about you guys. So, all right. I'm going to die. So what? When does this stuff take effect? 2, 3 years? 2, 3 minutes? What a lousy day this was. All right. I'm gonna lay here, and I'm going to die. You know what's going to happen? You guys are gonna go out, and you'll have dinner, and you'll sit and stare at each other. I was the only one who ever talked in this whole group. It was all Socrates, what is truth? Socrates, what is the nature of the good? Socrates, what should I order? Socrates, what are you having? And not once did anyone ever say, Socrates, hemlock is poison.
This sketch was produced when drugs were in fashion.
How do you do that? What? Make your body like rubber.
The way Plato wasn't there, and they didn't have rubber.